On a quiet autumn afternoon in 1944, as leaves danced their final waltz before the coming winter, Edgar Cayce sat before a rudimentary recording device, his trembling hands adjusting the wires with the same gentleness he once used to touch the souls of those seeking healing. The man who had dedicated decades to unraveling the mysteries of human existence through altered states of consciousness knew his earthly time was drawing to a close, and there were secrets that needed preserving. Before his voice fell silent forever, the recording, hidden for 80 years in a dusty Virginia beach vault, would reveal not only the final words of one of modern history's greatest psychics, but intimate confessions about the nature of the soul, the veils separating worlds, and the spiritual truths that religious and scientific institutions conspired to keep from those who needed them most. The elderly approaching the great transition. Cayce, at 77 and feeling the weight of thousands of psychic readings conducted over 4 decades, had grasped something that transcended all his previous visions, a revelation so profound it threatened the power structures of both religious and medical establishments of his time. The accompanying manuscript, written in a wavering but determined hand, began with a disturbing confession. For years, Cayce had been pressured by religious leaders, influential doctors, and even close family members to omit certain truths about the process of spiritual transition, especially those that could bring comfort and understanding to the elderly facing their final days. These truths, he revealed, were deemed too dangerous to share, as they could fundamentally alter how society dealt with aging, death, and grief. Through his recorded voice, still imbued with the ethereal quality that characterized his trances, Cayce began to unveil the secrets he had guarded for so long. He spoke of how in the final years of life, the veils between dimensions naturally become thinner, allowing the elderly to perceive spiritual presences with a clarity rarely experienced in their youth. This heightened sensitivity was not a sign of mental deterioration, as doctors often diagnosed at the time, but a gradual awakening of consciousness to higher realities that had always been present, merely obscured by the concerns and distractions of material life. The psychic revealed how he had observed, through his readings, that the elderly often began receiving visits from deceased loved ones months or even years before their own passing. These experiences were not hallucinations or products of declining minds, but genuine encounters with souls who came to prepare the way for the imminent transition. Cayce described how these visits followed specific patterns. First came the closest relatives, especially parents, spouses, and children who had passed before, bringing messages of love and reassurance. Then came dear friends, spiritual teachers, or even beloved pets who had shared deep bonds with the individual. The recording revealed even deeper secrets about the signs preceding death. Cayce explained how in the final weeks, many elderly individuals developed an inexplicable ability to foresee future events related to their family, as if receiving information from an expanded temporal perspective that transcended the limitations of linear time. They intuitively knew when grandchildren would be born, when family problems would resolve, or when significant changes would occur in the lives of their loved ones. This prescience was not accidental, but part of a natural process of consciousness expansion that occurred as the soul prepared to return to higher dimensions. The manuscript detailed how the medical and religious institutions of his time had systematically suppressed this information for reasons Cayce considered deeply self-serving. Hospitals and nursing homes profited from fear and ignorance about the dying process, keeping families in a state of constant anxiety and prolonging unnecessary treatments. Churches, in turn, feared that these spiritual truths might diminish the faithful's dependence on institutionalized doctrines, preferring to keep people uncertain about what happened after death to preserve their control over soul-seeking answers. Cayce revealed that during his deepest trances, he had accessed Akashic records showing how different cultures throughout history had understood and honored these natural processes of transition. Ancient civilizations like the Egyptians, Tibetans, and Celtic Druids possessed advanced knowledge of how to assist the elderly during this sacred phase of their lives, treating them as living bridges between the physical and spiritual worlds. This knowledge had been deliberately erased or distorted over the centuries by those who saw power and profit in maintaining spiritual ignorance. The recording took on an even more intimate tone as Cayce began to describe his own recent experiences with the spiritual world. He confessed that, in recent months, he had begun to perceive the constant presence of his mother, deceased decades earlier, who had been bringing him visions about the work he would continue to do after his own departure. These visions revealed that death was not an end, but a graduation to higher levels of spiritual service, where evolved souls continued to help those remaining on Earth, but with vastly amplified powers and understanding. The psychic described how he had witnessed, through his psychic readings, the actual process of soul transition at the moment of death. Contrary to traditional religious descriptions of judgment and separation, Cayce revealed that the experience was fundamentally characterized by unconditional love and a profound understanding of all the events of the recently concluded life. The soul was not judged by an external entity, but underwent a loving review where every action, thought, and emotion was seen within the larger context of spiritual growth and lessons learned. The most disturbing pages of the manuscript detail how Cayce was repeatedly instructed by authority figures not to share these truths with families who had lost elderly loved ones. Doctors argued that such information could interfere with the natural grieving process, while religious leaders insisted that only they had the authority to interpret the mysteries of the afterlife. Cayce had been threatened with lawsuits, excommunication, and even physical violence by those who saw his revelations as threats to their established interests. The recording then unveils the event that definitively transformed Cayce's perspective on these matters. A few weeks before the recording, during a particularly profound session, he experienced what he described as a temporary death, a conscious out-of-body experience that allowed him to directly observe the processes occurring on the spiritual plane as someone transitioned. In this extraordinary experience, he witnessed a gathering of souls in what he called a cosmic welcome room, where newcomers were greeted by committees of loved ones and spiritual guides who helped them understand their new existence. What most impressed Cayce in this vision was the discovery that many elderly individuals who had died in apparent states of mental confusion or physical pain emerged on the spiritual plane with complete clarity and perfect spiritual health. Brain limitations, degenerative diseases, and physical suffering were revealed to be merely temporary obstacles that did not affect the eternal essence of the soul. Even more surprising was the revelation that these souls often continued to interact with their earthly families in subtle yet significant ways, sending signals, influencing dreams, and even intervening in practical situations to protect and guide their loved ones. Cayce described how he had observed that elderly individuals who had developed some kind of spiritual practice throughout their lives, whether through prayer, meditation, contemplation of nature, or acts of compassionate service, experienced much smoother and more conscious transitions. Their souls were better prepared to recognize and navigate the new spiritual environments, while those who had lived exclusively material lives often needed longer periods of adjustment and healing. In the intermediate planes, the manuscript further reveals that Cayce had discovered specific patterns in the signs that deceased loved ones sent to their living relatives. These signs were not random, but followed a complex symbolic language that could be deciphered by those who understood the basic principles of interdimensional communication. Unexplained fragrances, objects moving or appearing in specific places, temporary glitches in electronic equipment, and even unusual behaviors in pets were ways in which transitioned souls attempted to communicate their continued presence and unwavering love. The recording then takes on a prophetic tone as Cayce begins to describe visions about humanity's future in relation to understanding death and aging. He predicted a time, a few decades in the future, when these spiritual truths could no longer be suppressed. A new generation of researchers, medical professionals, and spiritual leaders would emerge with the courage to challenge established structures and bring this information to public light. This transformation would fundamentally change how society treated the elderly, transforming them from perceived burdens into revered beings, seen as guardians of spiritual wisdom. Cayce revealed that he had received specific instructions from his spiritual guides on how families could best prepare and support their elderly loved ones during the transition process. These instructions included creating peaceful environments, filled with soft music, natural aromas and objects that evoked happy memories. More importantly, he emphasized the need to allow the elderly to speak openly about their spiritual experiences without judgment or attempts at correction based on purely materialistic worldviews. The seer described how he had learned that the final days of life often brought special gifts of spiritual clarity and insight that should be honored and documented. Many elderly individuals experienced moments of extraordinary lucidity, where they shared profound insights into the meaning of life, the purpose of human existence, and specific messages for family members. These final revelations were not ramblings of deteriorating minds, but precious gifts from souls who were beginning to see reality from an expanded perspective. The recording then reveals the most transformative experience of all, an encounter Cayce had with a spiritual entity who identified itself as an architect of transitions. This being explained that each human death was part of a larger cosmic design, where individual souls contributed to the collective spiritual evolution of humanity. The elderly who transitioned carried with them not only their personal experiences, but also fragments of the collective wisdom of their generation, which were then integrated into the Akashic records to benefit future incarnations. Cayce described how this entity had shown that cultural resistance to natural death and aging was creating a spiritual imbalance that affected all of humanity. By attempting to indefinitely prolong physical life and by denying the spiritual realities of the transition process, modern society was preventing souls from completing their natural cycles of growth and contribution. This resulted in an accumulation of unresolved energies that manifested as collective anxiety, widespread depression, and a sense of spiritual emptiness that permeated contemporary culture. The manuscript reveals that Cayce had been instructed to create a specific protocol for families who wished to properly honor the transition process of their elderly loved ones. This protocol included group meditation practices, rituals of gratitude for shared life, and techniques to facilitate continued communication with the transitioned soul after physical death. More controversially, it included methods for recognizing and interpreting the signs that indicated when a soul was genuinely ready to depart, distinguishing between premature death and natural transition. The recording reaches its emotional climax as Cayce begins to describe his own preparations for his imminent transition. He revealed that he'd begun receiving regular visits from a council of evolved souls who were planning his future work in the spiritual realms. This work would involve helping other souls understand and accept their own deaths, especially those who had experienced traumatic or unexpected transitions. Cayce would be transformed into a kind of cosmic spiritual counselor, using his earthly experience with psychic readings to guide confused souls through the early stages of their post-mortem existence. The seer confessed that initially he'd felt fear about leaving his family and his unfinished earthly work. However, the visions he'd received showed that his influence and ability to help others would expand exponentially after his transition. He would be able to work simultaneously with thousands of souls, both embodied and disembodied, in ways his physical form would never allow. This revelation had transformed his perspective on death from a dreaded experience into an early graduation to higher levels of service. In the manuscript's final pages, Cayce addressed future readers who would discover his writings. He implored especially the caregivers of the elderly, whether family members, nurses, or doctors, to recognize and honor the natural spiritual processes that accompanied aging. He encouraged them to see the elderly not as diminished patients, but as beings undergoing a sacred transformation who deserved reverence and spiritual support during their transitional journey. Cayce revealed that he'd hidden specific instructions within several of his psychic reading records, codes and references that, when properly interpreted, would reveal advanced techniques for facilitating communication with deceased loved ones, methods for recognizing reincarnations of familiar souls, and practices for developing the spiritual sensitivity needed to perceive the continued presence of those who had transitioned. This information was deliberately veiled to protect it from those who might use such knowledge for selfish or commercial purposes. The final recording revealed a personal prophecy Cayce had received about his own death and the events that would follow. He knew he would depart in January 1945, and that his death would be followed by a 40-year period of relative obscurity, during which his works would be studied by a small group of dedicated researchers. After that period, there would be a massive resurgence of interest in his work, coinciding with a global transformation in human consciousness about the nature of death and the afterlife. Cayce predicted that his own soul would return to Earth in a new incarnation around the year 2158, born into a civilization that had fully integrated an understanding of the continuity of consciousness after physical death. In this future life, he would work as a soul physician, assisting beings who chose voluntary transitions between different forms of existence as part of their spiritual evolution. Humanity of that future period would have developed technologies that would allow direct and clear communication with spiritual dimensions, eliminating the fear of death and transforming the aging process into a celebrated journey of spiritual growth. The manuscript concluded with a profound meditation on the true purpose of human existence. Cayce revealed that each individual life was like a single note in an infinite cosmic symphony, where each soul contributed its unique vibrational frequency to the greater harmony of the universe. The elderly represented the final notes of their individual movements, and their transitions marked not the end of their music, but its integration into the eternal symphony that continued to evolve through infinite dimensions of existence. The last diary entry, written in a shaky hand just days before his death, contained a final revelation that Cayce considered the most important of all. He had discovered that genuine love, especially the unconditional love shared between close family members, created energetic connections that transcended not only death but also time and space. These connections allowed related souls to find each other repeatedly through multiple incarnations, assuming different family roles but always maintaining the fundamental bonds that united them. The death of an elderly loved one didn't represent a separation, but only a temporary change of form, while the essence of the relationship continued to evolve in dimensions invisible to physical eyes. When Edgar Cayce finally silenced the recorder that autumn afternoon, he knew he had fulfilled his final mission on Earth. The secrets he'd guarded for so long were now preserved for future generations who would have the courage and wisdom to understand and apply these transformative truths. His soul could depart in peace, knowing he had planted seeds of spiritual understanding that would blossom when humanity was ready to embrace a new era of consciousness about the eternal nature of existence and the sacred purpose of each individual journey through the veils of mortality to the infinite light of eternal spiritual life.